the interim director. By a show of hands, out of curiosity, how many of you have ever been to Cambridge House? Okay, great. So for those of you who have not, let me warmly invite you to come visit. In fact, if you are a student, you are invited to a continental breakfast at Cambridge House tomorrow morning, in fact, at 10 a.m. And if you'd like to come to that, there's a sign-up sheet out the door. But I'll say more about that at the very end. In the meantime, you might be wondering, what in the world is Cambridge House? Well, it's a good question, and let me try to answer 3 different ways. First of all, Cambridge House is a place of hospitality. It's a home away from home for students. It's a place where you can come hang out. You can read, study, take a nap, play with the dogs, enjoy a cup of tea or coffee, have some refreshments, call your mom, or even hang out in our new hammock underneath the gazebo in the backyard. But it's also a Christian study center. It's part of the consortium of Christian study centers, which is headquartered in Charlottesville. And there are approximately 35 Christian study centers in the United States, with new ones added every year. But you also might be wondering, what happens at a Christian study center? Why do we exist? We aim to create a robust Christian community of faculty and students who explore the riches of the Christian intellectual tradition and who delight in the ways that faith speaks into all of life, and especially into academics. Cambridge House has a wide variety of events and programming, some more serious, like public lectures, some just pure fun, like walking around Lake Patoka or making s'mores. But all of our events, we want students and faculty to feel free to ask questions about life, meaning, and purpose, and to grow in thinking Christianly about all of life. So we hope you'll come visit us sometime if you've never come. If you have any other questions about Cambridge House, you can ask me afterwards. We're located just 200 steps from the edge of the William & Mary Business School. I have counted them. At 930 Jamestown Road in a big white house next to a bed and breakfast. And now I'd like to introduce my friend, Professor Scott Bickus of the William & Mary Kinesiology Department, and a member of the Cambridge House Faculty Advisory Council who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Paula. Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Scott Bickus, and as Paula said, I'm a member of the Department of Kinesiology, soon to be the Department of Health Sciences here at William & Mary over in the illustrious Adair Hall. And it's my pleasure tonight to introduce you to Dr. Jim Thomas, Professor Thomas, or just Jim, as he'll probably prefer that you call him. And I'm excited to introduce Jim to you for many reasons. I've known Jim now for about 20 years, going back to when I first landed in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, as a doctoral student in 2004. But before I talk about my own personal interaction with Jim and how he's come to become a mentor to me and somebody that I look up to as a public health and hero in many ways, I want to tell you a little bit about his career and what brings us to invite him to be our speaker tonight. Dr. Thomas is a professor of epidemiology at UNC Chapel Hill, where he focused his career over 40 years on the social forces and factors that influence infectious diseases. He focused a lot on reproductive health, and especially HIV and AIDS, and he also focused on the COVID-19 epidemic in recent years. At UNC, he served in a variety of positions. He was the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs for over 5 years. He mentored scores of doctoral students and hundreds of master's and undergraduate students over his several decades career. He was a member, a fellow at the Carolina Population Center, which is a multidisciplinary institute, one of the leading in the country that studies population health and demographic issues. And he was the director for 10 years of the Measure Evaluation, which is a USAID-funded major global health project that strengthens low and middle-income countries' health systems for monitoring and evaluation of health issues around the world, ranging from reproductive health to water sanitation and hygiene, nutrition, and everything in between. The grants on Jim Thomas's CV might make you shudder. It would be common to see figures like 36 million in repetition in terms of the amount of resources that he garnered to conduct public health research and public health practice and capacity strengthening around the world. The number of years and the number of countries that he's worked in are approaching each other. He's worked in 35 countries and extensively in some high disease burden countries, such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, where he was a missionary early on, and I'm hoping we're going to hear some stories about that from his early career. He currently he has a secondary interest, or maybe it was the same level of interest as infectious diseases, in public health ethics. And he was one of the principal authors of the U.S. Code of Public Health Ethics in our country. And he's also now busy helping European and African countries author and pen their own public health codes of ethics around the world. He does this in conjunction with being an adjunct professor, here we go, at the École des Hautes Études en Santé Publique.
Well done.
Right.
Yes.
That's high studies in public health. And he does that biannually, teaching intensive courses in global health. Jim has over 105 publications in peer-reviewed journals. He's published in the top epidemiology and global health journals in the world. He's also written a book, an influential seminal book, Epidemiologic Methods for the Study of Infectious Diseases, published by Oxford University Press. So the reason I started to meet Jim, I took one class I think with Jim, but I know he wasn't a member of my dissertation committee or any type of graduate advisory for me. But I met him because I was a student at UNC Chapel Hill, and at the time, myself and a number of other students who identified as Christian and kind of were trying to work our way through issues of faith and integrating those with our academic interests, were looking for other faculty to help kind of talk to when I was a graduate student. And we found Jim Thomas, who was referred to us by somebody, and we were just sort of forming a little group where we would read papers and invite professors to come to us, because we weren't getting enough papers, in our doctoral work. So we wanted to read papers and have people talk to them about us. And so Jim made time to do that. He came and talked with us about ethics in public health, and he helped turn on the lights for me to distinguish between what's the difference between religion versus morals and ethics, and to start develop vocabulary and language around that. He later would come to speak at a graduate university Christian fellowship organization that I was active in, just as a faculty member, speaking to encourage graduate students. What was more interesting to me is over the last decade and a half since I've been out of graduate school, how no matter when and for what purpose I email or call Jim, he's come to help in the form of a phone call if I have a question or I'm at a challenging place in my life or career and need some advice. He's also served, his articles are frequented in my course syllabi, and I've, for 15 years or more, had Jim Thomas's articles on incarceration and sexually transmitted infections as part of my course readings, Public Health Code of Ethics. But he's also zoomed in and done guest lectures with the advent of Zoom. I'm so happy that Jim agreed to come to talk to us from Chapel Hill, and I hope that you're as encouraged as I have been over the decades of knowing him about what he has to say. And he's spent his early years of being an emeritus professor not wasting any time, and he's been working on a book that's soon to be published on this topic that he's going to speak to us about tonight. So please join me in welcoming Jim Thomas.
Woo! Oh. So here's without, and here's with. What do you prefer? With. Okay. And here's my advancer. Thank you, Scott, for that. That was overly generous. They'd never go to the part about how he's a scoundrel and the most embarrassing moments. I mean, that would be entertaining. That would be I've got a long list. So I want to, as Scott mentioned, I have just finished a book. It's just weeks away from coming out in hard copy with this title, But I Meant Well. Unlearning Colonial Ways of Doing Good. It's in part reflections on my career. It's in part a review of history. And I can only give you a small sample of it tonight. I'm gonna pull a thread out of this book and hope that it's a compelling story. It's a story that is intended to raise questions. I want to hear questions from you. I welcome being challenged. So please feel free to chime in, and you can do it in the middle. You can do it towards the end. I'm going to try to leave time for generous discussion. So when hello. Oh. Nope. Got it. Okay. When I entered into public health in the 1970s, the big issue was not climate change as it is today. It was the population bomb. Overpopulation was going to cause mass famine. And there was a Christian author, Art Simon, who wrote this book, Bread for the World. He had a brother who was in the House of Representatives, so he was very closely tied to what was going on in politics. And that, I was a relatively new Christian. I became a Christian in high school during the days of the Jesus people, and when I never wore shoes, and I had long hair, and I had a headband, and so that was my entry into the Christian faith. And so when I read somebody who understood politics and was giving me a path to apply my faith in a way that would affect other countries and places of need, it was very appealing to me. So those are my initial motivations. I took my I went to University of California at Davis, UC Davis, where I studied nutrition because I was going to be a nutritionist and I was going to go to Africa. And I did. So the place that I went, and I think I have a pointer. You can't really see it, but see that little red dot there? That's where I went. The Congo is a huge country, the size of Europe. The capital is down here. And this is where so much of the trouble is, right here along the Rift Valley. But we were up here in the rainforest. And I trained a number of people as nutritionists to identify starving children and to nourish them back to health. You're going to see this fellow on the far right here. Oh, this guy here, his name's Dote. You're going to see him later at the end of this talk. When I came back from those 2 years working with, it was called the Paul Carlson Medical Program. It was a mission, but I was paid by the U.S. Agency for International Development. They had gotten a grant, and I was paid by that. I was convinced during that time of the importance of infectious diseases in causing malnutrition. Often that connection has to do with diarrhea. Very lovely topic, but a very real thing. One gets infected, and through unsanitary methods, they begin to get dehydrated and lose their appetites and don't eat, and then will die of malnutrition. So I became very interested in infectious diseases and got my PhD in epidemiology of infectious diseases. I eventually got hired at the University of North Carolina. Pause. I did not want to be a professor. I wanted to be going back to where I had just been. I wanted to be going back to the DRC. I became a professor because my wife and I were going to go as, do we use the term tent maker missionaries today? Do you still hear that term? So that was our goal. The idea being that we would pay our own way. We were going to work, we're going to get employed by some organization. But when you do that, you can lose your accountability, and we wanted to have an accountability group, so we formed a circle of people to advise us on when was a good time to leave. And when we thought it was a good time to leave, they didn't. They said, no, don't go. My wife's a physician. She had just gone through residency. We had hardly ever seen each other for several years. She would work up to 120 hours a week. There was a time when I brought home a hamburger. I think it was Hardee's. It was wrapped in a foil thing. And we were sitting on the bed about to eat our dinner. And she points to the hamburger and she says, "Did you get blood out of that puppy?" I'm thinking, no. So the first clue that she was a little off, sleep deprived. And then when we picked up our hamburgers to eat, she started to eat hers with the foil still on. So this is the sleep deprivation that she incurred by working so many hours a week. It's illegal now. They don't do this to medical students now. So our advisor said, no. You need to solidify your marriage first. Just stay put, get to know each other, then consider going. So we did. We ended up staying, it's another long story, I'm not going to take you through, but we ended up staying at UNC. And my first project was working in Wilson, North Carolina, which is just due south on I-95. I-95 runs through Wilson County. And there was a syphilis epidemic. Sexually transmitted disease epidemics are typically in big cities, inner cities, but this had stellar high rates in a rural area. So I was trying to understand what is going on in Wilson that they're having these high rates. So this is some of the neighborhoods that you can see. On the left is boarded up shops because populations are leaving these rural communities. There's a lot of poverty. This is the neighborhood here is on the African American side of town because, like you read in novels, like To Kill a Mockingbird, you had a black side and you had a white side. And there was a railroad track, literally a railroad track in the middle that separated them. And I found out through 8 years of research there that virtually every family that we were talking to, we were working with low-income African-American women. Every one of them had a story about incarceration. Sometimes it was their own. Usually it was a brother or a father who was either in or recently out, couldn't get a job, was going back in, and the community was just saturated with incarceration stories. So I began to look into how incarceration was playing a role in the creation, in the destruction of communities. We had a war on drugs that began right here in around the 1980s. And the way that the war on drugs worked was through the creation of some laws that forced prison populations to increase. There was what's called a truth in sentencing, which meant that if somebody was sentenced to 10 years, they served 10 years. There was no getting out on good behavior early. There was also a 3 strikes and you're out. So for your third drug offense, or guilty third drug offense, you're in for life. So there was a lot going in, but not a lot coming out. And so the population, as you can see, just exploded. And this was wreaking havoc in communities because, you're just losing so many people into the incarceration system. And then they're coming back out unable to get jobs, and the cycle begins. So I'm getting more and more agitated about these social forces that are causing epidemics that are affecting our communities. So I got involved into public health ethics. I wanted to write about it. I was looking for a language in public health that would be an ethics language. It didn't exist. There's medical ethics, but medicine addresses different kinds of ethical issues than public health does. So I found a circle of people who are fairly influential, and we wrote a code of ethics. One difference between medical and public health ethics is that medicine gives very high importance to the autonomy of the patient because there have been so many abusive actions done to patients who have so little power in the relationship with the physician who has all of the knowledge, all of the systems. In public health, it's a very different situation because we're dealing with whole populations. So if you could imagine somebody in this room, you've been a quiet group, but imagine if somebody in the middle here was like, had a real wet cough that just kept going and going. Just imagine how nervous you would be about that, especially post-COVID. And you'd be hoping, could you excuse yourself? Could you put on a mask? So in public health ethics, the autonomy of the cougher has to be constrained for the good of you all. So there's trade-offs that have to be made. So we were dealing with the interdependence of populations in public health ethics. I mentioned early on that I did not want to be a professor, and I got fed up with academics a couple of times. The first time I took a sabbatical and I studied ethics and philosophy and theology. But I came back. One of my favorite verses from the Bible. So maybe one of you can tell me where it is. It's, I think, Proverbs. As a dog returns to its vomit, so a fool returns to his folly. I returned to UNC and continued my work there, bringing ethics into the curriculum. But the second time that I got fed up with academia, I found a way to leave the university without leaving. I shifted my work into this project that Scott mentioned called Measure Evaluation. This is the website for the homepage of Measure. And I led a project that was funded by USAID that got mega bucks. Our weekly budget was $1 million. We were working in 40 countries at a time. We had staff all over it was fun. I'll admit it was fun, but it was huge. And it gave me some second thoughts, some mixed feelings about what I was doing. First, I'm going to show you a couple of more things before I get into those mixed thoughts. So here's some of the countries that we were working in. You see a lot of it is in sub-Saharan Africa, a few in Asia and Latin America. We even did a little bit in Eastern Europe. And these are the African staff, just a few of them actually, because we had a conference and not all of them could fly in. But I just love this picture, it's just so beautiful. So the mixed feelings came from, we were creating these standardized processes that work in all countries of how they're going to collect data. Creating systems that, because they're standardized, they take away some of the autonomy of the countries. Or when we're talking about countries, we often talk about self-determination. Taking away a bit of their self-determination of what they wanted to measure and saying, no, you will measure this. And if you don't measure it, we're taking our money away. And there was what's called a measurement burden that we were beginning to increase. If you've been to a doctor recently, maybe you've noticed that there's not a lot of eye contact that happens in a doctor's office. It happens, but it's not like it was 20 years ago because they have to enter more data as they're talking to you. That's like a data burden. We're putting the burden on the clinician to enter data. And as they enter more and more data, well, we can do fancy stuff with those data, but you lose that human contact. And we were kind of promoting that all over the world. And I had real mixed feelings about what are we doing? And are we laying a groundwork for neo-colonialism in which the American West, with its advances in AT, is telling the rest of the world how to dance? On one of my trips with this project, what time am I supposed to be done? Who's going to tell me?
We have about an hour scheduled.
Okay, so I'm supposed to be done in half an hour. Okay, we're good. Just don't want to abuse you. On one of my trips, I was in Ghana, and then spent a couple of days. I was there on a weekend, so I hired a car, and I went out to Elmina Fort. This is a fort on the coast where people who were gathered from the interior were brought and held here as slaves put on ships and sent to the West to be slaves. I took a tour of Elmina Fort. And you can see these two towers here. There's a courtyard right down below here. In that courtyard, there's the two towers right there. In that courtyard is this building. This building is a church. And that, I mean, it gives me goosebumps even now as I'm talking about it, that just sent chills down my spine to realize that, and let me make it a little bit worse. There's another courtyard that is smaller, and it's where the women would go to bathe. And the commandant, the male commandant, had a balcony that looked out onto the women bathing. And he would say to one of his soldiers, send her up. So imagine that man walking through that door and worshiping Jesus and coming out feeling all right. This just, it made me wonder, what have I bought into? What is going on with this faith? And I did a little bit more research and began to learn about what's called the doctrine of discovery. And the doctrine of discovery, this is the Portuguese built this. The Portuguese were the first to make it down along the coast of Africa to what was then called the Gold Coast, because there was gold. It's now called Ghana. And they wanted all of it. They wanted a monopoly, and they had to fight off everybody in order to have their monopoly. So they had their gunships down there. This is where the term gunship diplomacy comes from. So they had their gunships and their fort, but they were Christians, and they felt conflicted about what they were doing, enslaving people. So they appealed to the Pope to give them a rationale, to bless what they are doing. So he wrote a bull, B-U-L-L. He wrote a bull. It's an official statement, which you're going to read now. The bull said, "We, fortified with divine love, summoned by the charity of Christians and bound by the duty of our pastoral office, which concerns the integrity and spread of faith for which Christ our God shed his blood, wishing to encourage the vigor and the faithful and your royal majesty in the most sacred intention of this kind, we grant to you full and free power through the apostolic authority by this edict to invade, conquer, fight, subjugate the Saracens, who were Muslims, and pagans, and other infidels, and other enemies of Christ, and wherever established, their kingdoms, duchies, royal palaces, principalities, other dominions, lands, places, estates, camps, and any other possessions, mobile, immobile, goods found in all these places, and to lead their persons in perpetual servitude, and to apply and appropriate realms, duchies, royal palaces, and all those other things mentioned to you and your use, and your successors, the kings of Portugal." This was followed up later by another bull that said the same thing for the Spanish. And so I have spent years in personal, not paid therapy, but I mean like virtual therapy, wrestling with this. Like what is my faith? What did I buy into? This is before the Reformation, by the way. So this is our roots. Anybody here who claims to be a Christian, these are your roots. I'm going to I want to speed this up a little bit because I want to leave time for talking about discussions. And I'm going to skip some stuff. I'm going to skip this stuff. I'm going to get to this. But I have one more thing to say before I talk about this. one of the ways that I have teased this apart is to recognize that there's not a single Christian thread that goes through history. There are several Christian threads that go through history. When I read Jesus, I read about an upside down world where the last is first, and to love your enemy. But there's another thread that became enamored of power as defined by Rome, a very violent society. And what I see in these different Christian stories is disagreements over what is real power. Is it the power of Rome, which I call an imperial Christianity, with the hierarchies and the coercion and the subjugation, versus the upside down Christianity, which is a subversive power. It is subversive of empire. Jesus and Paul and the disciples stood against empire. That's what attracted me when I was first looking at this faith, is that subversiveness. I did not agree with what I was seeing as the commonly accepted power and the way things are arranged. I wanted to stand against that. And so to unlearn the ways that I had been taught, because I had been taught that more of that imperial type of power. I had been taught that as a white male, that it was never said this plainly, but as a white male, I'm better than others. That white Europeans are more civilized, more progressed, more technologically advanced, which is all an indication of their superiority, which they need to share generously with those poor people. So I came to realize that I had imbibed, even as I thought I was imbibing generosity and selflessness in Christian faith, I had accidentally imbibed also some racism, some entitlement that I didn't want in my life. And so we get to this, to unlearning. I have experienced unlearning those things first by questioning the narratives that I have been given of what is superior and what is power. I have unlearned it by imagining a world otherwise. Science fiction helps with this, to read imaginations of other worlds and how they work. I have done it by confessing, not to the people that I have offended, not like to Native Americans to say, I'm sorry, I'm living on your stolen land, but in conversations with friends that I have, just saying it out loud, I think I screwed up here, or I think we screwed up here, and then sharing in those discussions about how we screwed up. And then learning ways of resisting the patterns that I have developed over time. There's Dote again. I promised that I would show you him again. And I'm back 43 years later, visiting that same area. Dote was obviously alive and happy and came in. We're in church here. He came and greeted me in the front of the church. And I learned also on that visit that there are new challenges to this area of the Congo. This blue dot is where we are. And this is a peatland, a giant peatland. One of the reasons this area is so isolated. And these are all little concessions for logging. And so the community that is very, I'm going to say, simple. They don't use a wheel. They don't have animals that pull plows. Their farming is done by hand with hoes. That life is going to change just like, just like that. When these logging trucks start rolling in and laying roads and pulling out the logs, and then the loggers want to have internet, so they're going to raise towers, and they'll have cell phone towers, and then images of the rest of the world are going to creep in, and we're going to have major FOMO of, well, we're not that, we need to become that, and the whole world is going to change for them. And so if I had more time, I would be talking about how I'm wrestling with these issues in a way that is not colonial, because my colonial self wants to rush in and say, here's what we're going to do. But we need to be listening to the people who live on that land and how they are wrestling with these issues. I'm tempted to take this trump card and say, it's not your forest, it's the world's forest. And we need that there. Don't you dare let it be taken away. And this sense of urgency is what has driven so many colonial projects. It always comes with a sense of urgency. We've got to do it now, no time to think. We've got to work now. We're going to make you civilized, come on. So those are the things that I am unlearning. I'm going to stop so that we have time for comments and questions. Yes?
Do you not think the struggle that you're having is that people of color, as a biology student here at the college, ecology and evolution is basically taught is that we've come from apes and on way. And so therefore, to me, it's like, as a Christian, we're all one blood and one family. But this is steeped in our schools and the women married.
What is steeped in our schools?
Is that we've evolved, and so therefore people of darker color are inferior to the white man. I mean, this is all Darwin.
It's not all Darwin. Darwin, yes. But Jesuit missionaries played a critical role in the creation of race, our notions of race. The word has been around for a long, long time. It used to mean something closer to place. What's your place? When a Jesuit missionary named Acosta went to Latin America, he was on the equator meeting those people there, and the thought at the time, before people went there, was that people were darker in Africa because they had been burnt by the sun. So he goes to the equator in Latin America, and they aren't as dark. And he's trying to figure out a rationale of rethinking everything that he had known before. And so he creates this rationale of hierarchies of people, of who was more able to be receptive to being converted to Christianity. And it related to their technology, their languages, their laws. And coincidentally, that all mapped onto skin color. And so we have, well before Darwin, it goes way back to the Greeks, this notion of the savage. And we have the scale of savage to civilized. And this Jesuit missionary gave us gradations in between of the Japanese are more susceptible to conversion because they have an alphabet. They communicate like us. They're lighter skinned. The bottom of that scale was Africans. Now the irony is that if you look at that today, where is Christianity strongest? Stronger than here? It's in Africa. Not Japan. So these gradations we have had as our narratives for a long, long time. Another question. Yes?
You briefly touched on your data collection
Was I able to do what?
Were you able to go back and change?
No.
And how would you do it differently now?
Yeah, so the first answer is no. So working for USAID, you all know that USAID has been dismantled. It's basically gone now, right? And I have mixed feelings about that as well. They were the biggest show in town for people who wanted to do good internationally. They had the biggest money. When I was in the Congo the first time around, remember working for that mission station, I was paid by USAID. And yet their political intentions are just beneath the surface. They're always there. There are, no matter the administration, we are, as running that project, we are given words you can't use. Words you can't use. They're controlling the language that's used in the work that you are doing. There are three. I will answer your question. There are three D's of American involvement internationally. There's defense, diplomacy, and development. So USAID is the development, but it's that three-legged stool of American involvement internationally. So the development is done to keep people thinking of us as friends. That made it impossible to go back and do it differently. How would I do it differently now? I'm going to forget the acronym. I think it's OCAP, OCAP. And it came out of indigenous peoples. They have put forward these OCAP principles for data. Ownership, control, access, and P. Can't think of what it is. And so in some ways, in some way that I can't quite figure out the logistics of it, I would want to keep those front and forward of these countries having more say in their ownership of their data and deciding what their data are going to be, as opposed to dancing to our fiddle. That's the best I can do at the moment. I went to a meeting, I'm forgetting the country, I think it might have been Ghana, and it was just after the Ebola epidemic in West Africa. And it was called by the WHO, so we were there, WHO, Centers for Disease Control, and a few other big boys. And we were sitting in a room not much smaller than this. We had a big table, and we were all seated around, and everybody's got their laptops going. We've got a big screen that's showing us, where diseases are occurring. And we were in West Africa, and we had one representative from West Africa, and the rest was all Westerners who were deciding what the systems were going to be. So, confession. I've been engaged in neocolonialism, in data colonialism, and I'm struggling to figure out how to do otherwise, how to resist that. No easy answers, none. The struggle is really the thing. Another question. Yes?
So Jim, following up on Katie's question and kind of what you just said is, so if you could go and speak to Jim as he's considering taking the USAID project at the start,
Oof.
what would you tell him?
So, when I went to the Congo that first time around, I was 24 years old. I'd just come out of college. I had, at UC Davis, which is a land-grant college. Land-grant colleges were invented in California to take land from Native Americans and to make it into industrial farms. I worked on an industrial farm. I wanted to know how the food system worked. And so, because UC Davis is a land-grant college, I was able to take a course in tractor driving. And so, which was pretty cool. And so I learned how to drive the Caterpillar tractors, the ones with the big wheels, and all these different kinds of tractors. And I spent a summer working on a farm. It was a cooperative, a bunch of different farms that came together because the equipment I was driving was so big that if you drove it over a family farm, it would take one swipe and it would be done. I drove a tomato harvester, which has a crew of 6 people on the harvester and has another tractor driving right next to it, pulling a big bin. And then the harvester has these, it's called a stinger, but it's a conveyor belt that goes up and it drops the tomatoes into the bin. It pulls the tomatoes up out of the ground with these scissors that cut the plant off, and then it comes up a conveyor belt and separates the tomatoes from the vines, and these people would take the green ones and throw them over their shoulder, and the red ones would go on up into the bin. And that's the experience that I took to the Congo. It's like, I might have said to Jim, what business do you have going here? I didn't know, they hadn't even taught, I could tell you the structure of vitamin A, but I had never measured arm circumference, something as simple as measuring arm circumference to determine degree of malnutrition. There was so much I didn't know. When I look back, I think of the audacity that I had to have the confidence to have gone and played the role that I did. And yet, I formed deep relationships there, like Dote you saw there. I trained a woman to be the head of the nutrition project. Her name was Susanna. She later had a son who she named Jim Thomas. And so when I went back, a couple of years later, she introduced me to Jim Thomas. I'm like, wow. Yeah, I wish I had a simple, clean answer of what I would say to young Jim. What I ended up doing was a lot of listening. And I think that was the right thing. Just a lot of listening. They cook over open fires, and so I would go and join them. The missionaries had their own buildings, they had stoves, and they had cooks. But I would frequently go into the villages and sit and see how they were cooking and learn about their lives. I had studied French, I learned Lingala, the local language, and so I was able to converse. And probably a good year's worth of listening that brought me to a place where I could actually be helpful. Yes?
Well, with the shutting down of USAID, do you see roles for Christian organizations to step in as far as the nutrition or health or the agricultural?
There's certainly some gaps to be filled. The Christian organizations can't match the money. And the other advantage of USAID, who I don't really care to defend, but here I go. The other advantage of USAID is that they could have a unified approach. It's that standardization that I was damning a little while ago, right? But they could have a standard approach that the Christian organizations aren't going to have. They're all going to be different. They're all going to have their different emphases, and it's going to be kind of balkanized. So, yes, there's a role for the Christian organizations. There's a need for this unlearning that I'm referring to in those organizations. There's a lot of paternalism in Christian organizations. The group that I'm with now, that I go to the Congo with now, they're now called the Paul Carson Partnership. They are actively engaged in trying to surface their colonialism and to act differently. It's really encouraging to see. They're far from perfect, but they're actively engaged in that struggle. And that needs to happen more commonly. Another question. Yes. We have 2 minutes. Make it quick.
So, many of our students want to engage in work that has a social focus, whether it's in healthcare or whether it's through any of our academic disciplines. And to do that, college is the time where you're taking classes, but you're also really interested in experiential learning. And we have William & Mary does really well for experiences that are international or definitely cross-cultural, including breakout trips and things over spring break and over holiday breaks and so forth. And do you have any guidance about sort of how to engage in those experiences in meaningful ways? Because I don't hear you saying don't do those things, but how do you everything all of these experiences have some level of kind of a colonialist ideology, but I don't hear you saying like they're
Run away.
And they're not running away, but they're kind of also like somewhat necessary to take the steps towards a professional or an academic degree to even gain access to like a medical school or a school of type of health profession. How would you guide?
We're in a particularly weird moment right now, with the dismantling of so many systems. It's hard, I have so many colleagues who were working for these projects and now are not. And they can't jump to another project funded by USAID because that doesn't exist either. Even so, the skills that are taught in a school of public health are very important fundamental skills. I still value those very much. I don't think that, I'm just reading a crystal ball right now. I don't think that the world that we're seeing today, the American world we're seeing today, is going to be the American world we see 10 years from now. I think we're going to adapt somehow to re-engage with the world. It might look different, but it will be re-engaging with the world. I think that's coming. But I'm hearing a slightly different thing in your question here about, maybe I'm just projecting, but what I'm hearing is how to be practical and not just academic as you're learning your public health stuff. And so when I was an undergrad, on my Sundays, I went to the next town over. It's the town I eventually drove tomato harvesters in. And there was a homeless population in a park there. And a buddy of mine and I, we went over every Sunday and cooked pancakes for the men and the homeless in the park and sat and talked to them. The relational aspects, the particulars of people's problems that cannot be theorized are really important to know. Throughout my career, when I have had something, I usually do something for like 8 to 10 years and I move on to a new thing. So the incarceration stuff I was doing for about 8 to 10 years, while I was researching incarceration and building fancy models to predict what it's going to do to communities, I found an African American church that cared about incarcerated men. And the pastor, invited me onto the board of his nonprofit to develop a re-entry program in his community in Durham. So it was when the housing crisis had all the houses, people were losing their houses. And so the banks had these cheap houses, and we bought a cheap house and made it into a re-entry house. We found a man who could staff it and care for these other men who were coming in. So I wasn't just doing theoretical regressions on rates of incarceration versus teen pregnancy, which I did. I was sitting with men who had been incarcerated and hearing their stories and what they're struggling with and trying to help them get back on their feet. So I think that those first-hand experiences are critical, and they have shaped me quite deeply. Yeah.
We want to thank you so much for coming to join us. Before you leave, I have a couple invitations for you. The first is we have a drinks and snacks reception right out there, so if you would like to join us for that, feel free. It's an informal chance to ask some more questions one-on-one with Jim. Secondly, if you are a student and would like to join us at Cambridge House tomorrow morning for breakfast, an additional time to get a chance to ask your questions with our speaker, all you have to do is sign up on the sign-up sheet out there so I know how much breakfast to buy. We'll see you at Cambridge House at 10 a.m. We have one more after that. And if you'd like to join us for our end-of-the-year barbecue on May 3rd, then you can find out about that on our calendar of events, which is out on the table. Did I cover everything? Okay, so 3 invitations for you. Tonight, snacks, tomorrow, breakfast, and our end-of-the-year barbecue. But anytime, you're welcome at Cambridge House, and we really want to thank you guys for coming. And we want to thank you so much, Jim, for sharing so vulnerably and honestly about your career and giving us a lot to think about. So thank you guys for coming.